This is a very grainy image of the steamship CB Lockwood. Lockwood was a wooden-hulled bulk freighter designed to carry coal, iron ore, grains, things like that. In October 1902, she was sailing from Duluth, Minnesota to Buffalo, New York, when she sank in a storm off of Ohio. All 19 people on board managed to get off the ship, but only 9 survived the night. Lockwood's wreck was found a couple of days later when another ship spotted one of the masts sticking up out of the water. That same October, the old paddle wheel gunboat USS Michigan first officially surveyed the wreck. It was lying in a roughly east-west orientation in just over 70 feet, or about 22 meters of water. They also mentioned that the top of the hull at the western end was about 50 feet or 15 meters deep. The crew on Michigan placed a flag on the mast to mark the wreck, and over the next few months, other ships visited the site to replace the marker flags, add new buoys, or just generally check up on it. In addition to these visitors, Lockwood's wreck also began appearing on maps starting in 1906. It kept appearing on maps until the mid-1930s, when it seemed like mapmakers just decided to stop labeling it. So having been visited several times, appearing on maps for 3 decades, and being just a generally well-documented wreck, it should have been pretty easy to find again, right? Starting in the 1980s, there were several attempts to find it. In 1989, a group of divers went looking in the area where the wreck was labeled on maps. They ended up finding debris and equipment on the ground. There were things like davits and the roof of a ship's cabin, stuff that probably came from Lockwood, but they did not find the ship's hull. In 2001, another group went back to look for Lockwood again. This group found magnetic anomalies in the area, but they too did not find the ship's hull. In 2006, the Cleveland underwater explorers returned to the site to try and find it with side-scan sonar. They found the debris again, and this time they brought poles to prod the ground with in case there was anything buried. But once again, they did not find the ship's hull. It wasn't until 2010 that the Cleveland underwater explorers finally found CB Lockwood 15 feet under the lake bed. Now, shipwrecks and their site formation processes are very complex. No two are exactly the same, even if they sink right next to each other. But this is not normal. There's this idea in underwater archaeology called the Waterline Theory. It says that when ships land upright in a soft seabed, they can become buried up to their waterline, and usually not much past it. There are a couple of caveats, and we'll get into one of them in a moment, but we can see this phenomenon all around the world with shipwrecks of different sizes, materials, and water depths. Take, for example, this wreck. This was found during the search for Malaysian Airlines Flight MH370. Its exact identity is still unknown, but this was a 19th century iron-hulled sailing ship that was carrying coal when it sank. It is buried up to about its expected waterline, despite being more than 3,700 meters, or 12,000 feet underwater. Compare that to the battleship USS Arizona. She's a nearly 30,000-ton warship. Even though she's a very different design and much larger than the Indian Ocean wreck, Arizona is still buried up to about her waterline in only 40 feet or 12 meters of water. Lockwood should follow this idea, but clearly doesn't. Or at least not anymore. The thing is, the theory only really applies to the ship when it first sinks. Sediment can build up over time and bury the wreck, especially if the wreck has collapsed or the top of the hull has corroded away. Closer to shore, the tide or underwater currents routinely cover and uncover wrecks. There are many other outside forces that can move or bury shipwrecks, but the point is, we know that Lockwood was sitting on the lake bed immediately after she sank. There was that 20-foot difference between the top of the hull and the ground, plus one of her masts was still sticking above the water for at least a few weeks. Something must have happened to Lockwood. Right away, we can discount sediment covering the ship for a few reasons. When ships become covered in sediment, a mound forms around the wreck. The lake bed around Lockwood's wreck site is reasonably flat. The only features the underwater explorers mention are what they described as a network of underwater trenches. There are no mounds or sand dunes in the area. More importantly, the sediment in Lake Erie simply doesn't build up that quickly. In fact, the part of Lake Erie that CB Lockwood sank in accumulates less than 1 millimeter per year. Aside from intentionally dumping material, it would take thousands of years before enough of it could cover the 20 feet up to the top of the hull, plus the 15 feet she's buried in now. The other thing is that the lake hasn't really gotten any shallower over the last 100 years. The lake level can fluctuate, but it's still about 70 feet to the bottom. So buried probably isn't the best word, because it's more like the ship has sunken into the ground. Aside from Lockwood, there are a few other examples of ships in Lake Erie that are buried beyond their waterline, although Lockwood is the most extreme. There is a clear pattern of wrecks that sink into the ground, suggesting there is something about the lake that's causing this. The Cleveland underwater explorers believe that it has something to do with those trenches they found. They believe the trenches are a result of seismic activity. Northeastern Ohio is something of a hotbed of very small earthquakes. They are usually smaller than magnitude 3, although they have gone up to magnitude 5 a few times. Seismologists are still trying to figure out exactly why they cluster in this area, but there are ancient fault lines here. They aren't active faults like on the west coast, however, they do act as a weak spot in the Earth's crust. These faults are probably a part of the reason for all the earthquakes, even if they're not necessarily the direct cause. If the trenches the underwater explorers found were from this seismic activity, then it could reveal a reason why Lockwood is now under the lake bed. Earthquakes can cause soil liquefaction. When loose, water-saturated soil begins to shake or vibrate, it can behave more like a liquid than a solid. Soil liquefaction is a pretty big concern because it can cause buildings to sink into the ground. The underwater explorers speculate that these small earthquakes could liquefy the soil enough for a shipwreck to sink again. However, it's also probably not the only thing going on here. I mean, why would Lockwood sink so far down while some wrecks are only partially buried and others not buried at all? The underwater explorers also speculate that it probably has something to do with Lake Erie's geology. Remember how the lake bed around Lockwood's wreck is mostly flat and featureless? The landscape didn't always look like that. During the last ice age, this area was covered by the Laurentide ice sheet. The glaciers carved features into the landscape and deposited glacial till. We can see some of these glacial features in the other Great Lakes, except here in Lake Erie, the basins have collected a lot of sediment. Over the last 10,000 years, it has covered up those features, creating this mostly smooth landscape we see today. There are hills and valleys under the silt, so it's likely Lockwood sank over one of these valleys or otherwise deeper areas of soft sediment. The partially buried ships sank into a thinner layer of silt, though still thick enough to sink into. Then, the other non-buried wrecks are on a much more solid ground. If you'd like to learn more about the wreck of CB Lockwood, or the other work done by the Cleveland underwater explorers, I'll leave a link to them in the description. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more in the future, let me know in the comments. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.